The Volkswagen Twin Golf looked like an ordinary Golf that had quietly slipped out of the control of accountants, engineers, and common sense. From the outside, it still resembled the popular hatchback from Wolfsburg, but beneath that familiar silhouette was a machine Volkswagen had never built before and would essentially never repeat again. 2 engines, 2 drivetrains, the ability to drive the front axle, the rear axle, or all 4 wheels, turbocharging, experimental mechanics, and a goal so absurd that it fit the 1980s perfectly: to conquer Pikes Peak, the famous race to the clouds. This was not a tuning joke or a show car built for an exhibition stand. This was a real Volkswagen motorsport project, intended to challenge Audi, Peugeot, and the entire insane era of rallying and hill climb racing. In its most extreme version, the Twin Golf had around 650 horsepower, weighed just over a ton, and could accelerate to 100 kilometers per hour in around 4 seconds, and according to some data even faster. Its story is even more fascinating because Volkswagen came one step away from a great triumph. In 1987, Joachim Kleint drove the most powerful Twin Golf at Pikes Peak, and for a significant part of the route had a pace that allowed him to think about victory. A few hundred meters before the finish, a suspension component broke. The wheel practically came off, and the dream ended in the most brutal way. The Twin Golf did not win, but that is exactly why it became a legend. It is a car that proved that even a brand associated with practical cars for ordinary people could create something completely insane. The history of the Twin Golf begins not with the Golf itself, but with Volkswagen's ambition and jealousy toward Audi. At the beginning of the 1980s, the Audi Quattro changed the world of rallying, proving that all-wheel drive could be an absolute weapon in motorsport. Interestingly, Audi built its technology partly on experience gained from the Volkswagen Iltis, a military vehicle with all-wheel drive. Volkswagen Motorsport therefore saw that within the same group, a design had emerged that gave Audi a huge sporting and marketing advantage. The problem was that Volkswagen did not yet have a production-based, sporty 4-wheel drive system that could easily be transferred to rallying. Instead of copying Audi's solution, the engineers went in a completely different direction. If one engine can drive one axle, then 2 engines can drive 2 axles. That logic was simple, brutal, and very tempting. The front of the car could use one engine, the rear another, and the driver would receive huge power and all-wheel drive without a conventional drive shaft, central differential, and the complicated transmission known from Quattro. The first experiments were carried out even before the Twin Golf appeared. In 1981, the experimental Jetta Twin Jet was created, equipped with 2 GTI engines with a displacement of around 1.6 liters and 110 horsepower each. The car could drive in front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, or all-wheel drive mode, and during tests and demonstrations, it covered around 20,000 kilometers. It was the first proof that the idea was not merely a fantasy. After the Jetta came the Scirocco, which brought Volkswagen even closer to the vision of a true twin-engine sports car. The second generation of the Scirocco received 2 engines, enlarged to nearly 1.8 liters, each producing around 180 horsepower. Total output was around 360 horsepower, which was more than many supercars of the time, and enough for the press to begin comparing the experiment with the Porsche 911 Turbo and the Audi Sport Quattro. The theoretical top speed of the twin-engine Scirocco was said to reach as much as 290 kilometers per hour, while acceleration to 100 kilometers per hour took around 4.5 seconds. For Volkswagen, this was something incredible, because for years the brand had built its image as a manufacturer of solid, sensible, and popular cars, and suddenly it had technology in its hands that could embarrass far more expensive sports cars. A second twin-engine Scirocco was also built, equipped with newer 16-valve 1.8-liter units. At one point, limited production of a road-going version and the use of the design in Group B rallying were even considered. However, that never happened. Homologation would have required building a series of road cars, and the cost and complexity of such an undertaking were too great. Nevertheless, the experience gained proved priceless. Volkswagen already knew how to synchronize two engines, how to operate two drivetrains, and how to build a car that could use different drive modes. All that remained was to find an arena where the regulations would allow such an unusual construction to be used without having to produce a road-going homologation series. The perfect place turned out to be the Pikes Peak International Hill Climb in Colorado. This race, organized since 1916, had for decades attracted constructors ready for the most radical experiments. The route was almost 20 kilometers long, had 156 corners, started at an altitude of around 2,862 meters above sea level, and finished at more than 4,300 meters. In the 1980s, the road was still largely gravel, without today's asphalt character, and without any margin for error. The drops beyond the edge of the road were enormous, and the altitude mercilessly robbed engines of power. That is exactly why Pikes Peak was an ideal laboratory for turbocharging, all-wheel drive, and extreme mechanical systems. The rules were very liberal. The car had to be safe, but it did not need to have a production counterpart or meet the restrictive homologation requirements known from rallying. For Volkswagen, that meant freedom. It was possible to build a Golf with two engines and enter it against the most powerful machines in the world. An additional reason was Audi's presence. The brand with the four rings began appearing at Pikes Peak in the early 1980s and quickly proved that Quattro suited the mountain perfectly. John Buffum, Michel Mouton, Bobby Unser, and later Walter Röhrl made Audi one of the symbols of the event. Volkswagen wanted to show that it too could do something exceptional, even if its route to all-wheel drive was completely different. The first Volkswagen Twin Golf prepared for Pikes Peak was ready in 1985. From the outside, it still looked like a second-generation Golf, although widened wheel arches, additional air intakes, and racing details revealed that it was no ordinary GTI. The most important thing, however, was hidden behind the windows. At the rear, in the place of the back seat, a second engine was installed to drive the rear axle. At the front was another unit driving the front wheels. Both engines were naturally aspirated four-cylinder units, with a displacement of around 1.8 liters, prepared by Ettinger. Each produced close to 200 horsepower, and combined output was around 396 horsepower, according to some sources around 380 to 390 horsepower. Maximum torque for the whole system was around 460 Newton-meters. For a car the size of a Golf, that was an enormous figure. The car could accelerate to 100 kilometers per hour in around 4.5 seconds and reach a top speed of around 260 kilometers per hour. The driver was Jochi Kleint, an experienced German rally driver, European champion, and a competitor who knew Volkswagen extremely well. For him, however, Pikes Peak was a new challenge. Before the start, he had to learn the route in a rental car and dictate pace notes to himself, because practice on the mountain was limited. In the race, he finished third, which was an excellent result for a debut, but at the same time it revealed the main problem. Naturally aspirated engines lost a great deal of power at altitude. At Pikes Peak, altitude is the enemy of every internal combustion engine, but it treats naturally aspirated units especially brutally. The higher the car climbs, the less oxygen reaches the cylinders, and with the thinner air, power drops. Near the end of the route, losses could reach as much as 30 or 40%. Volkswagen quickly understood that if it wanted to fight Audi, it had to use turbocharging. In 1986, a second Twin Golf was therefore prepared. It looked similar to its predecessor, but technically it was far more aggressive. To remain in the correct displacement class, two smaller 1.3-liter engines derived from the Volkswagen Polo were used. Each unit received a KKK turbocharger and a Bosch K-Jetronic injection system. One engine produced around 254 horsepower at 7,000 revolutions per minute, and torque was around 260 Newton meters. Together, this gave around 508 horsepower and 520 Newton meters. The car weighed around 1,050 kilograms, so its power-to-weight ratio was excellent. It could accelerate to 100 kilometers per hour in around 3.5 seconds, while its theoretical top speed was said to reach as much as 310 kilometers per hour. What is more, the drivetrain still allowed the choice of front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, or both axles, depending on the configuration and gearbox connection. On paper, everything looked excellent. In practice, the car proved more difficult to control, more nervous, and not fully developed. Klein finished the race in 4th place, while Bobby Unser in the Audi Quattro S1 set a new record. The third and final evolution of the Twin Golf was already a completely different beast. Volkswagen and Kurt Bergmann decided that continuing to develop a production body shell no longer made sense. The car prepared for the 1987 season was therefore built practically from scratch. It was a silhouette-style prototype that only resembled an ordinary Golf. The central element of the construction became an aluminum monocoque connected to tubular space frames at the front and rear. The engines, suspension, and drivetrain components were mounted to them. The entire body was made from composite materials, reinforced with fiberglass, and designed so the car would still be instantly recognizable as a Golf. Volkswagen's marketing department insisted that the car should not receive gigantic wings similar to those used by Audi or Peugeot. In practice, this meant an aerodynamic compromise. The Twin Golf was around 20 centimeters wider than a production model, but it still retained a relatively civilian appearance. Steel doors, mirrors, and windshield wipers were retained, but most components were already pure racing hardware. The windows were made from plastic to reduce weight, and the entire car weighed around 1,015 to 1,020 kilograms without fuel. That meant that despite having 2 engines, the Volkswagen was only minimally heavier than the Audi Quattro S1. The construction was incredibly light, and at the same time highly advanced for the middle of the 1980s. The 1987 Twin Golf was essentially a racing prototype, dressed in the costume of an ordinary hatchback. The biggest change was, of course, the engines. Volkswagen abandoned the 1.3-liter units and returned to larger 1.8-liter engines, but this time equipped with 16-valve cylinder heads, turbochargers, and the advanced Digifant management system. Each engine produced around 326 horsepower, giving a combined output of approximately 652 to 654 horsepower. Maximum torque reached around 580 Newton meters. These were absolutely absurd numbers for a compact Volkswagen in the middle of the 1980s. For comparison, a production Golf GTI at the time had around 112 to 139 horsepower, and even the most extreme supercars rarely exceeded 500 horsepower. The Twin Golf, therefore, had power levels comparable to the monstrous Group B rally cars. Both engines were mounted longitudinally, which improved weight distribution and simplified the installation of the racing Hewland gearboxes derived from single-seater racing cars. Interestingly, the driver used only one gear lever and one clutch pedal. A mechanical linkage system synchronized the operation of both gearboxes. Additionally, it was possible to disconnect one axle and drive using only front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive. In practice, the driver had 3 different drivetrain configurations available during a single run. It was an incredibly complicated solution, yet brilliant in its simplicity. Volkswagen created a car that was technically far ahead of its time. What impressed in the Twin Golf was not only the power, but also the entire construction philosophy. The car was full of incredibly clever solutions. The radiators for both engines were mounted at the rear of the vehicle, where enormous ventilation openings and additional fans were located. During testing, it turned out that the rear engine became extremely hot, so a water spray cooling system was even implemented. The car contained a special tank and electric pump that sprayed water onto the radiators during the climb. A roof intake supplied air to the rear turbocharger, while side ducts cooled the fuel, which began to vaporize near the extremely hot exhaust system. The exhaust setup itself looked like the work of a mad engineer. Hand-welded manifolds and short side-exit exhausts gave the car a sound resembling two separate vehicles operating simultaneously. Each engine had its own distinctive tone. Interestingly, Volkswagen used many production parts. Some components came directly from normal road-going models, which made servicing easier. Even the gearboxes had roots in solutions later designed for sporty diesel GTI models. The engineers tried to use as many components as possible from Volkswagen's parts bin, but combined them in ways nobody had attempted before. The Twin Golf was therefore both a prototype and a strange experiment assembled from ordinary production car components. The key figure behind the project remained Klaus Joachim Joki Kleint. He was a highly respected driver in European rallying, although often overshadowed by bigger names. He worked with Opel, Saab, and Volkswagen, gaining experience alongside the legendary Erik Carlsson. It was from him that Kleint learned the left-foot braking technique, which later became extremely important in the Twin Golf. The car required a very specific driving style. The driver had to keep the turbochargers under boost, while simultaneously controlling slides on the loose surface of Pikes Peak. Kleint later recalled that the most important thing was keeping the revs above 4,000 RPM and using left-foot braking while keeping the throttle applied. This prevented the turbochargers from losing boost pressure. The car had an almost perfect 50-50 weight distribution and handled surprisingly neutrally. Despite its gigantic power, Kleint claimed that the Twin Golf was very predictable and gave enormous confidence on loose surfaces. Unlike many brutal Group B cars, it did not constantly try to kill the driver. The car reacted smoothly and remained stable, while slides were easy to control. It was exactly this balance and traction that gave Volkswagen a real chance of beating the much more famous rivals from Audi and Peugeot. The 1987 Pikes Peak race went down in history as one of the most spectacular clashes of the Group B era outside the World Rally Championship. Audi brought the legendary Quattro S1 E2, driven by Walter Röhrl. Peugeot fielded the 205 T16 with Ari Vatanen, and Volkswagen arrived with the most insane Golf ever built. The media focused mainly on the battle between Audi and Peugeot because both manufacturers had huge experience and world-famous drivers. The Twin Golf was treated more like a technical curiosity than a genuine contender for victory. However, during practice, it quickly became clear that the Volkswagen was frighteningly fast. Kleint deliberately practiced while running only one engine, so he would not fully reveal the car's potential before the race. On race day, the car worked perfectly. The smaller turbochargers provided quicker response, the suspension handled the rough terrain brilliantly, and the all-wheel drive system delivered unbelievable traction. At the halfway point of the course, the Twin Golf recorded the second fastest split time, very close to Röhrl, and according to some measurements, it was even leading. Kleint later recalled that the car felt perfect, and that he genuinely believed he could win. Everything ended literally just a few corners before the finish. A suspension mounting component cracked, and the front wheel practically tore itself away from the car. Only around 400 yards remained to the finish line. The Twin Golf could no longer continue safely. Volkswagen lost its chance for the project's greatest victory because of a tiny mechanical component, while Walter Röhrl crossed the finish line and set a new Pikes Peak record. It is precisely this defeat that turned the Twin Golf into a legend. If Volkswagen had simply won the race and ended the project, the car would probably only be remembered by dedicated motorsport enthusiasts today. Instead, the story of a car that came within touching distance of defeating the Audi Quattro and Peugeot, only to be stopped by a suspension failure a few hundred meters before the finish, has something both tragic and fascinating about it. The Twin Golf symbolizes an era in which manufacturers were willing to build completely insane machines solely to gain an advantage in one specific race. The project was extremely expensive and complicated, yet at the same time, practically impossible to use in normal rallying. Motorsport regulations were becoming increasingly restrictive. Group B was nearing its end, and twin-engined cars were simply too complex to make commercial sense. After 1987, Volkswagen terminated the entire project. No production version was created. There were no further attempts at Pikes Peak, and no successor to the Twin Golf ever appeared. Only in 2018 did Volkswagen return to Pikes Peak with the electric IDR and, in a sense, finally settle unfinished business with the mountain by setting a new course record. Yet for many fans, it is still the twin-engined Golf that remains the brand's most fascinating project in hill climb racing history. To this day, the exact number of twin Golfs built remains a matter of debate, but it is generally accepted that Volkswagen Motorsport created 3 main examples prepared for the consecutive Pikes Peak events in 1985, 1986, and 1987. Besides them, earlier prototypes such as the Twin Jet and the twin-engined Sirocco existed as test platforms. The first Twin Golf from 1985 was long considered lost, but it later resurfaced in private collections in Germany and was restored. The second and third examples remain under the care of Volkswagen Classic and the company museum in Wolfsburg. The most famous remains, of course, the 1987 car that underwent a full restoration before returning to public demonstration runs at historic events. The rebuild process was extremely difficult because Volkswagen had preserved almost no complete technical documentation. Mechanics had to analyze the car piece by piece and recreate many systems from scratch. The greatest challenge proved to be synchronizing the operation of both engines and both gearboxes. After many years, however, the car was finally returned to full working condition. Today, the Twin Golf appears at historic motorsport events and Volkswagen exhibitions. Every appearance generates enormous attention because even today, the concept of a hatchback with 2 engines and more than 650 horsepower sounds completely absurd. The current value of the Volkswagen Twin Golf is practically impossible to determine accurately because cars of this type almost never appear on the open market. One of the earlier examples was once listed for sale for around €50,000, but that was many years ago before historic rally cars reached today's price levels. In reality, the modern value of the most famous Twin Golf could easily amount to several million euros. It is a unique factory-built Volkswagen Motorsport prototype, directly connected to Pikes Peak and one of the most legendary eras of hill climb racing. The car carries enormous historical significance and is also absolutely unique from a technical standpoint. In the world of collectors, such vehicles are treated more like engineering artworks than ordinary automobiles. It is difficult even to find a direct comparison for the Twin Golf. No other production-based hatchback with 2 turbocharged engines ever fought against the Audi Quattro S1 and Peugeot 205 T16 at Pikes Peak. Growing interest in Group B legends and historic prototypes continues to increase the value of such machines. If Volkswagen ever decided to sell the 1987 example, the auction would likely attract collectors from all over the world. For motorsport fans, the Twin Golf is a symbol of a time when engineers could pursue the wildest ideas without the restrictions imposed by modern regulations and corporate calculations. The Volkswagen Twin Golf remains one of the most extraordinary racing cars ever created by the Wolfsburg-based manufacturer. It did not win major titles, it did not conquer Pikes Peak, and it never entered production. Yet despite all that, it became a legend. It was a car born in an era when engineers searched for advantages everywhere, even in ideas that seemed completely absurd. 2 engines instead of 1, 2 drivetrains, selectable drive axles, and more than 650 horsepower in a hatchback weighing around 1 ton still sound today like the project of a crazy tuner from the internet. Yet Volkswagen actually built it and came incredibly close to winning one of the world's toughest races. The Twin Golf proved that creativity could sometimes replace conventional engineering solutions. While Audi developed Quattro, Volkswagen created its own unique path to all-wheel drive. The project did not survive for long, but it left behind one of the most fascinating stories in 1980s motorsport. To this day, many fans still consider the Twin Golf to be the craziest Golf ever built, and it is difficult to disagree. It was a car that looked like an ordinary compact hatchback, but in reality, it was a racing monster capable of fighting the most powerful machines in the world high in the Rocky Mountains.